The ground was littered with the broken bodies of their attackers, the air thick with the acrid stench of scorched alien flesh. "Not bad for a pampered science officer," Gregory grunted, wiping insect gore from his blade. "Didn't think you had it in you." Eric holstered his weapon, his face impassive. "And I didn't expect a brutish human to possess such skill with a primitive weapon. It seems we both underestimated each other." With the immediate threat neutralized, the two turned their attention to the more pressing matter of survival. They rummaged through the wreckage of Eric's ship, salvaging what supplies they could. The outlook was grim. "We've got enough food and water for a few days, maybe a week if we ration it," Gregory said, counting out the meager provisions. "Ammo is running low too." Eric held up the damaged distress beacon, its casing cracked and circuitry exposed. "Our best chance is to repair this and call for help. With the right tools, I could have it operational in a matter of hours." Gregory shook his head. "We won't last that long without water. We need to find a clean source and fast." The two argued back and forth, their voices rising in the stillness of the canyon. Eric insisted that repairing the beacon was their top priority, while Gregory maintained that securing water and food was essential for their immediate survival. "If we don't fix the beacon, we'll be stuck on this hellhole indefinitely," Eric snapped, his yellow eyes flashing with frustration. "And if we don't find water, we'll be dead before help arrives," Gregory countered, his jaw set. In the end, they reached an impasse. Neither was willing to concede to the other's plan. With a tense, grudging agreement, they decided to split up. Gregory would venture into the jungle to search for water and food, while Eric remained at the crash site to work on the beacon. As Gregory set off into the dense foliage, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was a mistake. Separating on a hostile world went against every survival instinct he had, but his pride wouldn't allow him to back down, not to an arrogant alien who looked down on him as a primitive savage. The jungle closed in around him, a suffocating green embrace. Almost immediately, he encountered the first of the planet's many hazards. A patch of innocuous-looking ferns suddenly lashed out with barbed tendrils, nearly ensnaring his leg. Gregory hacked at the vines with his knife, barely avoiding their grasp. He pressed on, his senses on high alert. The ground beneath his feet shifted treacherously, and he realized too late that he'd stumbled into a quicksand pit. The more he struggled, the faster he sank. It was only by jabbing his knife into a nearby tree root and hauling himself out that he managed to escape, his heart pounding with exertion and adrenaline. And then came the reptiles. They emerged from the undergrowth like scaly, dog-sized demons, their fangs glistening with venom. Gregory fought them off with a combination of desperate knife slashes and well-placed kicks, his training the only thing keeping him alive. By the time he located a small, fast-moving stream, his clothes were torn and he was bleeding from a dozen superficial wounds. But the water was clean and clear, and he filled his canteens with a sense of weary relief. Venomous alien fangs snapped inches from Victor's neck as he hurtled through the dense, fog-shrouded jungle, predators hot on his heels. These beasts, a hellish hybrid of wolf and crocodile, were just one of the reasons Planet X259 had been quarantined by the Galactic Federation as a notorious death world. But for humans like Victor Bennett, a hardened mercenary and survivalist, this was just another Tuesday. Victor's heart pounded in his ears as he sprinted through the tangled undergrowth, his boots splashing in murky puddles. His only hope was reaching the hidden escape pod where he'd stashed weapons and supplies. Just as the pack was about to overtake him, engines roared overhead. A sleek, silver spacecraft descended through the canopy into the clearing ahead. The airlock whooshed open, revealing a tall, slender alien with pale blue skin and glowing yellow eyes. It was the Lin, a high-ranking Denobulan science officer. "Get in," the Lin shouted over the beast's snarls. With a final burst of speed, Victor leapt into the ship. The creatures converged just as the airlock hissed shut. Victor collapsed against the wall, gasping as the craft descended. But he had leapt from the frying pan into the fire. The Denobulans, though technologically advanced, were an arrogant species who saw humans as barbaric primitives. A long-standing grudge simmered between their kinds. The Lin glared at Victor with barely concealed disdain as the jungle fell away below, teeming with ravenous monsters, toxic flora, and virulent diseases. Victor knew every second on this death world was a fight for survival, and being stranded here alongside this uptight alien, cut off from human help while the Federation sought to cover up the planet's secrets, was a death sentence. They'd have to do the impossible, cooperate to escape alive despite their species' bitter enmity, or else this world would claim 2 more victims and Victor would die never seeing another human face again. As the alien ship soared into the clouds, Victor pushed himself to his feet, sweat pouring off his face. He turned to see the Lin slumped against the wall, catching his breath. The two eyed each other warily, tension crackling between them like a live wire. What the hell is a human doing on this forbidden planet? The Lin growled. I could ask you the same thing, Blue Boy. Last I checked, the Federation has no jurisdiction here. Before the Lin could retort, a shrill alarm pierced the air. Red lights flashed across the control panel. The power core is leaking radiation. The hull must have been breached during our escape. Fallon's long fingers flew over the controls, trying to contain the damage, but more alarms blared in response. The ship lurched violently, throwing them both off balance. I can't stop it. We have to make an emergency landing now. The craft plummeted from the sky, shaking and rattling as it plunged into a rocky canyon. Metal shrieked as the ship skidded across the uneven terrain before slamming to a halt, sparks showering the fractured hull. Battered and bruised, Victor and the Lin stumbled from the smoking wreckage. They stared at the ruined ship, the gravity of their situation sinking in. It's totaled, and the distress beacon is toast. We're stranded on this hellhole with no way to call for help, Victor said grimly. A loud buzzing filled the air. They whirled to see a swarm of massive insects, each the size of a dog, emerging from crevices in the canyon walls. The bugs' iridescent carapaces glinted in the harsh sunlight as they zeroed in on the crashed ship, drawn by its residual energy. Looks like the welcoming committee is here, Victor muttered, reaching for his knife. The Lin unholstered a sleek laser pistol. I suppose we'll have to join forces, human, if we want to survive this. The insects dove at them, stingers dripping with venom. Victor lashed out with his blade, hacking through chitinous armor, while the Lin fired precise energy blasts. They fought back-to-back, a whirlwind of flashing steel and searing lasers. As the last of the monstrous insects fell, its carapace shattered by a well-aimed shot from Fallon's laser pistol, Victor surveyed the battlefield with a sense of triumph. Back at the crash site, the Lin labored to repair the distress beacon. It was delicate, frustrating work made all the more difficult by the limited tools at his disposal. He cannibalized parts from the ship's damaged systems, his long fingers deftly rewiring and soldering. As he worked, the planet's creatures tested his defenses. Insectoid scavengers the size of rats skittered into the ship, drawn by the scent of the rations, while venomous serpents slithered through gaps in the hull, their forked tongues tasting the air. The Lin fought them off with controlled bursts from his laser pistol, the acrid stench of burning flesh filling the cramped confines of the ship. He was close, so close to completing the repairs. Just a few more adjustments, and the beacon would be operational. He could taste the triumph, the satisfaction of proving his superiority over the human brute. And then the ground heaved beneath him, throwing him against the wall. The ship groaned and shrieked as the canyon walls collapsed, tons of rock and debris raining down like divine judgment. The Lin barely managed to throw himself clear before the vessel was buried, the distress beacon still inside. He lay there, battered and bruised, staring at the mountain of rubble that had once been his only hope of escape. The bitter irony was not lost on him. For all his vaunted denobulant superiority, he was now well and truly stranded, dependent on the skills of a human to survive. With a heavy heart, he set off into the jungle, following the human's trail. Pride had brought them to this point, but if they were to have any chance of making it off this world alive, they would need to set aside their differences and work together. The question was, could they? The Lin stumbled through the tangled jungle, his denobulan tracking device emitting a faint, pulsing glow. The human's trail was fading fast, obscured by the planet's relentless growth. He hacked through the dense foliage with a plasma machete, sweat dripping down his brow. A guttural roar shattered the humid air. The Lin whirled, his energy pistol drawn. A monstrous creature burst from the undergrowth, its 6 powerful legs propelling it forward, razor-sharp claws glinting in the dappled light, and a wickedly barbed tail lashing behind it. The Lin fired, searing beams of energy slicing through the air. The beast howled as the blast seared its hide, but it kept coming. It lunged, claws outstretched. The Lin rolled, but not fast enough. A searing pain lanced through his arm as the creature's talons found their mark, carving a deep gash in his blue flesh. Gritting his teeth, the Lin fired again, aiming for the monster's eyes. The beams found their target, and the creature reeled back, shrieking in agony. Seizing his chance, the Lin fired a sustained blast, the smell of charred flesh filling the air. The beast convulsed and fell, its body smoking. The Lin staggered to his feet, clutching his wounded arm. Indigo blood seeped between his fingers, and a wave of dizziness washed over him. He shook his head, trying to clear it. He had to keep moving, had to find the human. As he pressed on, the jungle seemed to close in around him. The air grew thicker, more oppressive. His wound throbbed with each step, sending jolts of pain up his arm. He could feel the alien toxins seeping into his bloodstream, his body's natural defenses overwhelmed by the planet's hostile environment. His vision blurred, and his legs grew heavy. He stumbled, his tracking device tumbling from his grasp. The ground rushed up to meet him, and he lay there, his breath coming in ragged gasps. This was it, he thought. This was how he would die, alone on this godforsaken world, bested by a primitive ecosystem and his own hubris. Through the haze of pain and fever, he heard a rustle in the undergrowth. He tensed, expecting another predator, but instead, a familiar figure emerged. It was the human, Victor, his face streaked with dirt and sweat. "Blue boy, you look like hell," Victor said, kneeling beside him. The Lin tried to respond, but his tongue felt thick and clumsy in his mouth. As Janice watched Robert examine his wound, he noticed the human's brow furrowed in concentration. "Lucky for you, I know a thing or two about this planet's nastier critters," Robert said. He pulled a pouch from his belt and rummaged through it. "This might sting a bit." He crushed a handful of leaves into a paste and applied it to the wound. Janice hissed in pain, but almost immediately a cool, soothing sensation spread through his arm. The fog in his mind began to clear, and he found he could breathe easier. "Why are you helping me?" Janice asked, his voice weak. Robert shrugged. "Let's just say I'm not ready to be the last intelligent being on this rock. Besides, you're no good to me dead." With Robert's help, Janice made it back to a water source, a crystal-clear stream nestled in a small glade. As he drank deeply, letting the cool water soothe his parched throat, he found himself reassessing the human. Perhaps there was more to Robert than he'd initially believed. Over the next few days, as Janice recovered, the two began to work together in earnest. Robert shared his knowledge of the planet's edible plants and natural remedies, while Janice used his technical expertise to fashion rudimentary tools and weapons. They constructed a lean-to shelter, using broadleaves to create a waterproof roof. "You know, for a stuck-up science officer, you're not half bad at this survival stuff," Robert said as they sat around a small fire one night. Janice allowed himself a small smile. "And for a primitive human, you're surprisingly resourceful." It was a fragile truce born of necessity, but it was a start. For the first time since crashing on this world, Janice felt a flicker of hope. Together, they might just have a chance of making it out alive. But that hope was short-lived. As they explored the jungle, searching for resources and possible escape routes, they began to notice signs that they were not alone. Footprints in the mud too small and light to be theirs, broken branches, and disturbed vegetation, as if something had been moving through the undergrowth. Then they saw them. Shadowy figures darting through the trees, always just at the edge of their vision. Primitive humanoids, their skin mottled green and brown, blending almost perfectly with the jungle around them. Robert and Janice tried to make contact to show they meant no harm, but the natives were skittish and distrustful. They vanished into the foliage at the slightest movement, leaving only fleeting glimpses and the eerie sense of being watched. Tensions rose as the days passed. The natives grew bolder, coming closer to the camp, their spears and blow darts at the ready. Robert and Janice took turns standing watch, their weapons never far from reach. One morning, as Robert returned from foraging, he found Janice locked in a tense standoff with a group of native warriors. They circled the camp, their faces painted with fierce designs, their weapons leveled at the Denobulan. "We come in peace," Janice said, his voice steady despite the sweat beading on his brow. "We mean you no harm." The natives chattered among themselves in their guttural and unfamiliar language. One, a tall male with a headdress of colorful feathers, stepped forward. He gestured at the shelter, at the fire pit, and the scattered tools, his expression dark. Janice spread his hands, trying to convey his peaceful intentions, but the warrior only gripped his spear tighter. He barked a command, and the other natives began to advance, their eyes hard and unforgiving. Robert burst into the clearing, his knife drawn. "Back off," he snarled, putting himself between Janice and the warriors. "We don't want trouble." The tall native let out a harsh laugh, the sound sending chills down Robert's spine. He raised his spear, pointing it at Robert's chest. The message was clear. The human and the Denobulan were trespassing, and the natives would defend their territory at any cost. Robert and Janice exchanged a glance, a silent understanding passing between them. They had come too far, fought too hard to let it end like this. As the natives charged, howling war cries, the human and the Denobulan stood back to back, ready to fight for their lives on this alien world that had become their crucible. Robert's blade flashed as he parried a vicious spear thrust from a painted warrior. Beside him, Janice fired his pistol, dropping two natives with well-placed shots. The air rang with the clash of steel and the hiss of energy weapons. Suddenly, Robert spotted a gap in the natives' defenses. "There," he pointed with his knife. "Some kind of structure. Let's move." They battled their way forward, slashing and shooting. The jungle gave way to a clearing, revealing a cluster of overgrown buildings of Denobulan architecture, but long abandoned. Robert kicked open a rusted door. Inside were the remnants of a laboratory. Shattered tanks lined the walls, viscous fluid pooling on the floor. Janice paled at the sight of mangled native corpses, their bodies twisted by horrific experiments. "What is this?" Robert growled. "What did your people do here?" Janice shook his head, eyes wide with horror. I don't know. This is monstrous." A spear clattered against the door frame. The natives had followed them. Robert slammed the door shut, bracing it with his shoulder. "Those experiments," he spat. "That's why they want us dead." Janice looked ill. "I can't believe it. How could we?" His words trailed off as the door shuddered under the impact of the natives' assault. Robert gritted his teeth. "Doesn't matter now. We need a plan." Janice glanced around the lab, his eyes falling on a series of chemical tanks. "I have an idea. If we can rupture those tanks, the explosion should destroy the facility and take out half the jungle with it." "Including us," Robert countered. "You have a better idea?" Robert hesitated, then shook his head. "Let's do this." He turned to face the door, knife at the ready. "I'll hold them off. You set the charges." Janice nodded, already moving toward the tanks. He worked quickly, rigging the volatile chemicals with trembling hands. The door splintered as the natives redoubled their efforts. "Whatever you're going to do it fast." Robert shouted over the din. Janice connected the final wire. "It's done. 30 seconds. They sprinted for the exit, the timer counting down. The natives scattered as they burst from the facility, Janice's pistol spitting fire. 20 seconds. They ran, crashing through the undergrowth. Behind them, the natives gave chase, their cries of rage echoing through the jungle. 10 seconds. A spear whistled past Robert's ear. He risked a glance back and saw Janice stumble, the Denobulan clutching his side, blue blood seeping between his fingers. 5 seconds. Robert grabbed Janice, half dragging him forward. The jungle exploded behind them, a wave of heat and shattered debris. The force of the blast threw them to the ground, ears ringing. Robert pushed himself up. The facility was gone, reduced to a smoking crater. The natives were nowhere to be seen, dead or fled. He knelt beside Janice, gently rolling him over. The spear had punched clean through his torso, leaving a gaping wound that pulsed with each labored breath. "Guess I messed that up," Janus wheezed, his face ashen. Robert shook his head. "You did good, Blue Boy. Real good." Janus coughed, flecks of indigo blood spattering his lips. "Get out of here, human. Finish what we started." His eyes fluttered closed, his chest still. Robert bowed his head, a lump in his throat. He hadn't asked for this, hadn't wanted this, but the weight of Janus's sacrifice and the horrors they'd uncovered settled on his shoulders like a leaden cloak. He stood, retrieving Janus's pistol from the blood-soaked soil. The weapon felt alien in his hand, a relic of a society he no longer understood. With a final glance at the ruined facility, he turned and limped into the jungle, the first step on a long and uncertain path. The journey back to the crash site was a blur of pain and exhaustion. Robert salvaged what he could from the wreckage, repairing the distress beacon with numb, mechanical movements. As the signal pulsed out into the void, a promise of rescue, he found himself dreading the prospect of returning to the galaxy he'd once called home. A rustling in the undergrowth, a flash of mottled green skin. Robert tensed, hand dropping to his pistol. But the figure that emerged was no warrior, but the native leader, his headdress gone.